All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the good introduction there, Doug. Again, Brian Fuchs coming at you from the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Have a lot of slides today that I'm going to go through pretty quickly, but really catching some key points. As I just was mentioning to Doug and Dennis prior to the call, is there's been a lot going on in the region, a lot of extreme weather, a lot of ups and downs as far as temperature and precipitation and other factors that have really been notable over the last month from when we last met. So going to get started here on my first slide. And so just some general information. Doug mentioned a lot of this, who's all collaborating. The next call will be on September 15th at same time with Darren Clabo from the South Dakota State Fire Meteorologist Office out at the School of Mines. He's going to be presenting for us. You can get information on future webinars at this link. Past webinars are archived at the bottom link. And as always, if you have a question, put it in the chat and we'll try to get to everyone's questions at the very end. And also at the end.
Brian, there's a couple of people with their hands raised. I'm not sure why. Let me just, Dennis pointed that out to me. Let me see. There's nothing in the question box. Maybe it was a mistake on your part, maybe not. But I'm going to ask Samantha Capps, if you have a question or a comment, even if you have a comment, go ahead and put it in the question area. Same with, well, anybody else. So sorry about that, and go ahead.
Okay, so continuing. So the agenda for today, we have talking about current and recent past conditions. We have some regional impacts, general ones, hydrological, agricultural, some outlooks, and then hopefully at the very end we'll have some time for questions from what we're talking about. So fires and floods and drought. Oh my. Kind of playing off the Wizard of Oz here, and you can see that we've had everything from droughts to floods to fires happening in multiple places across the region, and we're going to really touch on some of those events during the next hour. So let's look at July. The numbers came in from NCEI, the National Center for Environmental Information, as Doug mentioned, and these are our rankings. So we have 128 years of data on these. Starting with temperature, you can see that most of the region was near average in the central Midwest to the upper Midwest, but most of the states surrounding that were above average. And as you go further south in the country, you can see much above average for temperatures in July. Precipitation rankings, again, 128 years. Kentucky right up there in July, which makes sense with some of the flooding and some of the rains that we've seen through the state. It looks like the Eastern Corn Belt, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio have also been quite a bit above average. A little bit drier in parts of the upper Midwest and near average through the western portions. You know, Montana came in pretty wet too this go around. So July, again, as much of the summer has been, depending on where you're at, you were probably warm. Maybe warmer than normal, and then precipitation definitely has been quite variable and spotty, even within states. Looking at the 3-month climatology, so this is May, June, and July, and starting with temperatures again, a lot of those light oranges up there. So outside of Montana, pretty much the entire region was above average. About the highest rankings were coming in Kansas and Indiana and Ohio, as far as their rankings go in the region here. And for precipitation, quite dry in some places. You know, Nebraska at 25th, Iowa at 29th. They kind of were the center of the dryness. Wetness up in North Dakota, quite the contrast from where we were a year ago. And then we see that wetness in Ohio and Kentucky off on the eastern edges of the region. So just over the last 30 days, what have our temperatures looked like? Pretty much anything that's not green on this map is an area that had above normal temperatures to some degree. The oranger areas in western Nebraska into Kansas and Montana and the Dakotas, 2 to 4 degrees above normal. And those areas in green, they were anywhere from a degree or 2 below normal. It seems like north central North Dakota was probably the coolest during this stretch. And we're looking at current soil moisture anomalies. And current, I'll put in air quotes because there is a lag to this data product of several days. So some of the most recent rains are not yet incorporated into this product. But the couple areas I have circled really focused on, Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and into parts of Minnesota, and then the neighboring states. Quite the deficit of soil moisture right now, and even highlighted an area out in the Northeast that has been of interest to folks lately, but definitely seeing from the central to western Corn Belt quite the contrast in wetness and dryness, and it's showing up in the soil moisture products. So what's our evaporative demand been? So this product is really looking at how much moisture the atmosphere would be taking if it was available. And we can see those areas in Iowa and Nebraska, again, down into Kansas, portions of Michigan even, and even Ohio, where that demand has been kind of above normal, what I would say. Those are those reds and orange areas. And almost the entire region, again, really related to temperature, where we've seen those warmer than normal temperatures. Of course, demand is going to be above normal as well. And again, this is looking back 3 months. So what do we look like for precipitation over the last 30 days? So I got a couple suites of maps here. The left-hand map is going to be departures from normal, and the right-hand map is going to be percent of normal. And so when you look at departures, you don't see really, you do see these broad areas where the yellows are up to 3 inches below normal. Some of those oranges are 3 to 6 inches below normal. So we are seeing pockets of Iowa and Kansas and even into Nebraska, northern Missouri, where some of those departures over the last 30 days have been pretty significant. But then you also see those greens and blues, and look at Kentucky, 6 to 9 inches above normal in those blues, and the purples are 9 to 12 or even more above normal. And that's really caught that area through Missouri, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, the entire state of Kentucky, and then pockets again through the region. You could really see some localized differences, especially over the last 30 days. And when you look at those percent of normals, you see a little more discontinuous pattern. But again, looking at like Kansas, those areas, what they were 3 to 6 inches below normal, that's only 5 to 25% of normal precipitation for the last 30 days. And typically that's a wetter time of the year climatologically. And you can really see, again, some of those purples and blues where they've had an excess. And we go back even 90 days. So this takes us all the way back from mid-May to the middle of this week. And again, we see those oranges and darker oranges are anywhere from 3 to 6 to 6 to 9 inches below normal, which we see in several areas of Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, even into Minnesota and parts of the Dakotas, and even Indiana and Illinois, kind of a lingering pocket of dryness in there. But on the flip side, again, you look at Ohio and southern Illinois and southern Kentucky, and a lot of that in southern Illinois has really been over the last several weeks. So we've kind of flipped the switch in southern Illinois, going from a fairly dry status at the beginning of July to fairly wet here as of late. And even further west, you look at places like Colorado and Montana and Wyoming. Some of those areas over the last several months have been quite wet, and especially with some of that monsoonal moisture pumping up into those regions, they've benefited from that. And then again, percent of normal on the right-hand map. And again, you can see some of these areas really extremes of 150 to 200% of normal during this time, both on the east and west edges of the region. It looks like the middle of the region has really been where problems as far as adequate precipitation have developed over the last 90 days. Looking at the calendar year, again, on the departures from normal, again, anything that's green or blue, we're seeing a positive departure, meaning that we're above normal during the calendar year. And those areas in reds and oranges and yellows, we're showing deficits. And some of those areas in red, that's 9 to 12 inches below normal. So northeast Nebraska, southern tier of Iowa, parts of western Kansas, really been what I would call the hot spots as far as missing out on calendar year precipitation. And as many folks remember, it hasn't been just since January. A lot of this dryness started and developed last fall. I don't have a graphic up for the water year, which would be October 1st to present, but you would see these numbers even look worse if I did have that number up there. So the calendar year tells us a little, but not really the full story even. So regional impacts, just some photos here quickly to share. A lot of reports around Kansas have failed soybeans and sorghum crops. And here's a picture here on the left from Chip Redman that he shared with me. And then some fires have recently broke out in parts of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Wyoming. And Darren shared this photo of the fish fire by Sundance, Wyoming that has recently happened. So South Dakota, there was a lot going on. Some of the key impacts have been really noticing reduced yields, especially in the southeast part of the state. Just some of the yield numbers that are on here. I'm not going to read through all these, including large grains and small grains. And we're looking at reductions anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of less than what's expected in a given year. And again, we really saw that with the previous maps, looking at where it has not rained and where it's been warmest, and really looking at where some of these areas did not have good soil moisture to begin the growing season. These are areas where we're seeing the most issues, and a lot of these numbers are coming in from southeast portions of the state that I have noted here. But then also, let's look at Sioux Falls. A little over a couple weeks ago, 5.44 inches of rain, breaking an all-time record and for any day, and including that day. And the previous record for that date and time was only 1.88 inches back in 1938. So really what that is showing, and yes, Sioux Falls set the record, but many of these places, it seems like when we are seeing the precipitation, it's these deluge type of events. We're getting a lot of rain in a short period of time, and then we may go weeks in between those rainfall events. And so not only is it kind of scary sometimes to just look at the amounts, but you got to look at how those rains did come. And going back to this slide again, Sioux Falls is in that southeast part of South Dakota, where we have seen the yield reductions and some of the problems on the agricultural side. But then again, you have a record rainfall event almost right in that same area. So again, perspective and really changes on very short distances is something that has been the theme across much of the region this summer, not only in South Dakota. Talked to Pete up in Minnesota. It's been colder and wetter recently. Things are looking better. The crops look good. He did note that there's some lingering stress on some trees that really started a year ago with the drought, and we're seeing some oaks even having some issues with stress and then disease getting into them. As I mentioned from Chip in Kansas already, some of the sorghum and soybean issues and failures, especially in the south central part of the state, have been noted. Corn in the southeast portion of the state is going to come in around 40 bushels to an acre, give or take, depending on of course, the field, the location, et cetera. But just kind of overall, they're pointing at that 40 number, and typical yields are about 120 in that area. So quite a bit of a reduction, 2/3 reduction. No water supply issues though, because again, the drought situation has really been more of a short term. Water systems are still looking pretty good. And, talking about failure of soybeans in Kansas, but then Pete showed the picture of the soybeans up in Minnesota that he took recently in the photo here. And you can just see the contrast between two parts of the region here. Wyoming and Colorado came in as well. Hay supplies remain tied up in Wyoming. Some fire activity, which we've already talked. Another picture of that fish fire from Darren. Just incredible to see some of that. Becky Bollinger from Colorado came in and talked about the summer dryness in northeast Colorado has been hard on crops, but it's been kind of isolated to that part of the state. Much of the rest of the state has had a good monsoon season and above normal precipitation, and that's really helped reduce the fires at this time, as well as some abnormally high relative humidity levels that they typically don't see. A lot of moisture in the atmosphere in Colorado here recently. Kentucky, that's a state that's kind of ran the gauntlet. We started out with some dryness, and then the tables really turned on an abundance of precipitation. Again, some of these numbers coming in from especially the eastern portions of Kentucky, some of these numbers have never been met. The North Fork River, where the gauge was 6 foot higher than any previous record before it even failed, so it probably was even more than that. Monthly totals of over 17 inches of rain from some of the mesonet sites, 24-hour precipitation. of over 8 inches in places. And then the impacts to the different sectors, washed out roadways because of floods on the transportation side, and same with utilities. A lot of areas were without power and clean water, and even communicating through phone lines and cell towers has been impacted. And then some of these same crops that were stressed from drought were now lost to flooding. So as a producer, you've kind of been on both sides of the spectrum, all in the same growing season. And then the last one was kind of note. We're seeing schools that are going to be starting late in Kentucky because of damage to buildings, infrastructure around those schools that the kids can't even get there. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because you typically don't think of, our education system being impacted by climate and weather events. Ohio and Indiana, Beth Hall said there's no issues at this time, which is good. Again, I mentioned some lingering dryness in parts of the state, but not impactful. Ohio, plentiful rainfall in some areas and drier in some others, just again, depending on where you are in the state. Longer term dryness throughout pollination of corn is probably going to lead to some yield reduction. The estimates coming out of there around 10% right now, and it's not and right now no impacts to stream flow. With some of the higher humidities that they've seen in Ohio, that's increased the disease pressure on the different plants, crops and non-crop as well. And August so far has been below average, and so that's been helpful to kind of finish off some of the ag season up there, but also lack of concerns. Michigan and Missouri update. Again, Michigan's one of those states that dryness had intensified earlier in the summer, but the last few weeks has brought some relief. Specialty crops are moving right along with harvest. Apple harvest starting soon. Full production mode on many of the vegetable and small crops, as I'd call them, or specialty crops. Yields have been good, and irrigation has made a big difference, especially in some of those areas of lower Michigan that did have the dryness. And the dry conditions in July helped to reduce plant disease even. So again, you look at some of the positives of that dry period, not only how it can impact plant production, but also plant health. Missouri, flooding and drought at the same time. Northern Missouri definitely has been wetter than southern Missouri, with a significant flash drought developing during July in southern Missouri and into Arkansas and surrounding areas. And then we've had this historic flood event that hit the St. Louis area the evening of the 25th into the morning of the 26th, with reports up to 11 inches of rain in just over 8 hours. And there were sadly 2 fatalities reported with this. And I'm sharing the graphic from the Weather Service in St. Louis, just talking about some of this. And the one bullet is the third one that stood out to me: 25% of our normal yearly rainfall in 12 hours. And again, you talk about extreme events. Here's the radar estimates from that St. Louis event. For those familiar with the I-70 to I-64 corridor going into Illinois, those blues and light blues are in that 9 to 12 inch range. And it wasn't in one little pocket. That's in a pretty large area. And again, came in anywhere from 6 to 8 hours over those areas. And again, sadly 2 fatalities, but it definitely could have been worse with seeing those rains. Very similar to what Kentucky saw as well with this event. So that's kind of where we've been this summer. So topsoil moisture coming from USDA and their weekly NASS reports. The current value of the percent of soil moisture on the short to very short end is the number shown, and then the number below it is the change from last week. So if it's a positive change, so like Iowa's went up to 53, that's saying last week they were at 50% of the soil moisture was being considered short to very short. That's increased. And you can see, again, this division between the region from east to west. And looking at Kansas and Nebraska and Wyoming and Montana, even into Missouri and South Dakota, some of these numbers are, over half of the soil moisture is considered short to very short, and those changes are still taking place. Some drying out still happening. But on the flip side, the eastern areas have been wetter, and again, soils are reflecting that. We're going to start talking about some of the agricultural statistics here. So instead of showing the crops in their good to excellent range, I actually doing the opposite. I'm showing percent poor to very poor. And similar to the soil moisture maps, these are the current amount as being deemed poor to very poor based on the weekly reports coming out of those states. And you can see that quite a bit of the Western Corn Belt is showing that kind of stress. And the thing I really want to pick out here is the red line is the current year. And I want to thank Brad Rippey from USDA for providing these and Dennis for passing them along. But it really looks like where the red line currently sits at, it's a middle of the road type of year. But really look at the trend and on really corn and soybeans both. We started out back at the beginning of June and things were looking really good, and we've had a steady decline since then. And where that's going to bottom out, I'm not going to put a guess out there right now. I don't want to be on the hook for that, but we definitely have seen this steady decline of corn conditions over the past several months. And where are we in corn production right now? The dent stage is where we're approaching, and you can see that the percent of each state in that stage already. But what you're also seeing is those the change number below is the change from the 5-year average. So many outside of Michigan, most states are running a little bit behind. Michigan and Colorado are showing a little bit ahead. But again, that cool spring that we started with is showing up here, not dangerously behind, but it is noted that production levels are a little bit slower than a typical 5-year average would have it. Production forecast is looking at 14.4 billion bushels, down 5%, down 1.6 bushels per acre on average from last year. And we had a little bit less corn planted this year compared to past years. Looking at soybeans the same way, again, the eastern grain belt is looking better than the western as far as the condition of poor to very poor soybeans. And some of the changes have been pretty rapid here over the last couple weeks, especially looking at, or I guess these are changes from last year, excuse me, for this point in time. So, looking at places like Nebraska and South Dakota and Kansas, where last year there was record to near record production, we've kind of changed that by quite a bit here this year. Looking at the soybeans again, that red line is really in the middle to of the bunch, going all the way back for the last 20 years. But that trend line, not as sharp as corn, but definitely have seen production conditions changing over time, and they've been declining. Some late rains would do wonders for finishing out the soybean crop in the region. Really fill those pods up this time of year. Speaking of pods, most production areas are showing that pods are being set, and you can see that change from the 5-year average. So even in some of those places where corn was maybe slightly behind, like Nebraska, soybeans are a little bit ahead. Same with Michigan and Ohio compared to the 5-year average as far as when they started seeing pods setting on those plants. So soybean production is looking for a record high USDA estimate of 4.53 billion bushels, up 2% from last year, and yields are expected to average right at 51.9 bushels per harvested acre, which is up a half a bushel from last year. But there was also some more total planted area, down less than 1% from the previous estimate, but up 1% from last year. So a little bit over 88 million acres in soybeans this year, which is again, where we saw the change from corn. Sorghum, which is considered to be typically more of a drought-tolerant crop, here's the percent of poor to very poor on sorghum, and Kansas and Texas really are, or Kansas through Texas are really some of the main sorghum producing areas of the country, and you can really see how this summer has impacted sorghum. This year, yield is going to be down 23% from last year, while the total production is going to be down 36%. And again, just to reiterate, a lot of times producers are putting in sorghum to kind of hedge their bets to drought. And even this year, we're seeing some of those drought-tolerant crops, especially from the reports like Chip had from Kansas. Many acres are going to be failed this year. And again, looking at how the index of conditions look compared to other years, And this one, we are closer to the bottom, and that trend line is even sharper than it was for corn on that red line. If you follow 2022, currently we're approaching some similar conditions from the early 2000s, and even potentially getting to 2011 and 2012 when we had the big drought through the region as well. So we'll see how sorghum ends. But again, that trend, it went from doing pretty decent in early June to quite steady and sharp decline since then. And then there's no issues as far as, I guess there are issues concerning pasture and rangeland conditions. I said that backwards. That really from the central to southern plains, really a lot of issues as far as forage production, forage conditions, pasture and rangeland conditions. Again, this is the percent from that's poor to very poor, and the change from last year. So quite a bit of, again, the central portion of the region has really declined. And what makes that even more difficult is the availability of feed on the open market and transportation costs with diesel fuel prices this year. The further east you go in the region, it has not been as problematic. Some of the pictures out of southern Missouri, southeast Kansas, and into Arkansas and Oklahoma from July and into the first part of August, forage production just stopped. Pretty much just stopped at the beginning of July, and many of those livestock producers were seeing things burn up in quite a rapid pace due to the heat and dryness. Looking at crop indemnities, and this is for any type of loss, not just related to drought or heat. This does include flood as well. And so you can see the counties across the country that have really been impacted by crop indemnities. Again, this is a crop insurance program from RMA. And again, if you're in that yellow to orange range, you've seen millions to $5 million losses already. Those that are in the reds and dark browns are $5 to over $10 million in crop indemnity losses already reported for this year. And these will continue to come in through the rest of the production season. So now let's change paces a little bit on the hydro side, start looking at the Missouri River here. System storage is at 51 million acre feet, a little bit less than last week. System storage is shown on the plot and the red line where we're at. And, realistically, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner the drought issues on the Missouri River. This only is compared last week, and also the reservoir levels pretty much where you want to be for this time of year, even with some of the reduced flows on the river this year. Speaking of stream flows, we're looking at the region as a whole. And again, once you get into Iowa and Kansas, Nebraska, into Colorado, and even Wyoming and parts of Montana still, you can still see that some of these percentiles, the orange is below normal, the red is much below normal, and then the bright red is the lowest reading. And you can see that there has been some below or low flows on a lot of the major river and stream flows to the region, except when you get into southern Illinois, Indiana, into Kentucky, and parts of Ohio even, as well as what's still going on in the Dakotas, where they've had an abundance of moisture since last fall, and a lot of those flows are still running quite high. So we got a drought update and just a photo from Russ Schumacher, the state climatologist in Colorado, and this is in northeast Colorado, just showing some of these dry conditions on some of these lands out in that part of the state. So we had today's U.S. Drought Monitor. And what we can see is, again, the eastern portions of the region, some short-term drought still lingering in some pockets of Illinois and Indiana and Michigan. But the further west you go is when things become more problematic. As Dennis recently said, there's been more of what we'd call a flash drought developing in portions of southern Iowa lately, and that's on top of the flash drought that we had developed in southern Missouri and parts of Arkansas and surrounding areas earlier this summer. And then that area from, Sioux City in northeast Nebraska down to southwestern Nebraska and into northeast Colorado and almost all of western Kansas has really been under the gun going back to last fall. And these have been the driest areas over the last several months, and where we do have both D3 and D4 quite prevalent in that area. So when we look at the U.S. as a whole, about 41% of the country is in drought right now. Compared to a year ago, we were at 40%. So even though those numbers are quite similar, it's where the drought is taking place this year compared to last. Currently, we have a little over 29% in D2, which is severe drought or worse across the country. And as of today's map, 130 million people are being impacted by drought. So that's why we're seeing it across our newscast and in the media. A lot of people are being impacted by drought across the country this year. When we zoom into the region, we get a better idea of some of those areas in Kansas and Nebraska that were highlighted. We did have some D3 in southern Missouri not too long ago that's kind of leached into southeast Kansas. Currently, the region that I'm showing is at right at 33% of the region is in drought. A year ago, we were at 51%. So the region as a whole is actually better than we were a year ago. 3 months ago, we were at 42%. So we have seen some steady declines. Just again, depends on where you're at in the region when you're talking about such a large area. Talking about it as a whole is tough sometimes, and this is just a great map showing that the eastern portions, even where we had some earlier dryness, that's since recovered and in some instances went to flood conditions, but more in the central and western parts of the region, it's been more progressively drier and lingering dryness. Again, that goes all the way back to last fall. Just looking at the drought monitor change map, so over the last 8 weeks pretty much takes us from the middle of June to the middle of August. Those areas that are in yellows and oranges and browns, that's where we've seen overall degradation during that eight-week period, and those areas in greens and blues are where we've seen overall improvement during that 8-week period. So yeah, look at portions of southern Colorado and through Wyoming and even up into Montana. The western areas have done better this summer and even started off the year better in most instances than the central and eastern areas. And again, look at southern Missouri and southeast Kansas, southern Iowa, into northeast and Nebraska, southeast, South Dakota, some of those areas, just over the last 8 weeks, we've seen that change. And again, you can see those flash drought changes in southern Iowa as well as southern Missouri and into Kansas. They stand out with those 3 and 4 class degradations over that time. So the last part of my talk before we go to questions is I'm going to go through the climate outlooks, and you can see here what I'm going to focus on during this portion. So here is the next 7 days, and some of our partners to the south really could see some significant precipitation that they haven't had for much of the summer. And so that would be interesting to see how this plays out. Again, the monsoon in the southwest is continuing to carry on, which has been very beneficial down there. But you can see in much of the central plains, Nebraska and the Dakotas, not much precipitation. But if you go west of there into Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, things look better. And if you go east again, all those areas in the lighter blues are an inch to an inch and a quarter over the next week, which again, finishing off some of those crops, get those test weights up a little bit better, help with some late season forage, even though typically after August that's a little bit harder to do. But again, just moisture to the region.
Yeah, Brian, maybe comment on the timing of this rain so late in the growing season and how much, obviously going to fill a lot of reservoirs, but how much is it going to do? How much good is it going to do for crops that have already failed in these areas and or pasture and rangeland? Do you want to say anything, or Dennis, do you want to say anything about that real quick? Because I did want to hit on this later, but I thought since you had it up.
Yeah, I'll take a stab, and Dennis, if you want to add on, please do. But yeah, Doug makes a good point. In some of these areas in Kansas and Missouri and places where we have seen crop failure for the year, on some of those grains such as sorghum and soybeans, and especially pasture and grazing land conditions, these late season rains, for any late soybeans, it's probably going to help with yield because some of those pods will continue to set and fill in during this time. It really depends on when those soybeans went into the ground. Anything that's failed is not good. This isn't going to bring them back. Like I kind of hit on some of the late season forage production, rains past August, typically they're not going to do much for growth. it's going to help. And at this point in time, we're probably looking at how it's going to impact planting of winter wheat in some of these areas, as well as start banking that soil profile for moisture into next season.
And yeah, Brian hit the main points. That's exactly it. We're thinking now about what's the next crop and can we put more moisture in the soil for next year. That's it.
Okay. So moving on, 8 to 14 day outlook. So this takes us pretty much through the end of the month. We have temperature outlook on the left and precipitation outlook on the right. Over the next 8 to 14 days, again, some of this cooler weather that we've seen in August through a lot of the region really looks like the odds are that it's going to continue through the end of the month, which again, that helps lessen that atmospheric demand and demand on crops. And so where we do get rain or where there's ample moisture, the production will still continue, and it is a positive. As far as precipitation goes, again, that monsoon bullseye just kind of sits out, and CPC's done a good job. Climate Prediction Center has done a good job with that all summer. But we do see some the probability of dryness in the upper Midwest and northern plains and into the northern Rockies kind of increasing here over the next couple weeks. And again, we have some near normal and above in green, and it seems like this is the pattern we've really seen over the last 6 to 8 weeks generally is really what this is showing. As we look at the monthly outlook for the entire month of September, so that takes us into the end of September, we got temperatures again on the left and precipitation on the right. And it looks like we have some heat settling in the southwest that will also build into portions of the central region with some probabilities of above normal temperatures being shown. A lot of equal chances in the region where, again, you could just as easily be above or below normal for temperatures during the month. For precipitation, we do see this quite large dry signal that's prominent from Nebraska and Iowa through Minnesota, Wisconsin, into the Dakotas and Wyoming, catching parts of other states. But again, like I mentioned earlier, really a continuation of what we've seen through much of the summer through this part of the country. When we go into our seasonal outlook, so this is for all of autumn, September, October, and November. Wow, the temperatures look to be really dominating on the above normal chances of above normal precipitations, especially when you start looking into those Four Corners regions into Colorado. Probably looking to experience above normal temperatures. And again, when we start thinking about October and November, some of that could be impacting the early snow seasons in the Rocky Mountains as well. So something to make note of as we go forward. And again, seasonal precipitation, we start transitioning to a drier time of the year, climatologically speaking. So seeing these bullseyes over Colorado and portions of Kentucky and Indiana and Illinois of above normal chances of below normal precipitation, that does start to become of a concern, especially when we start talking about soil moisture recharge for the 2023 year. But many of the producers in this area, this is telling me that problems due to wetness during harvest season, right now, I would probably go out on a limb and say they're probably going to be minimal this year. And the winter outlook, December, January, February, and again, I want to make note up in the upper left-hand corner here, the official NOAA National Weather Service winter outlook will come out in the third Thursday of October, so that's 10/20 of 22 this year. So this is the first chances of what we can see. Much of this is La Nina driven, where we will see warmer than normal conditions across the southern tier of the U.S., as well as drier than normal conditions. And we do have that above normal precipitation bullseye over the Ohio River Valley region that does tend to stand out in a La Nina situation, as well as that over the northern Rockies and Montana and Idaho and into the Pacific Northwest. And I'll talk about that a little bit more on another slide. So a La Nina three-peat. So we typically tend to become more concerned about La Nina through the winter season. And what this is showing through IRI at Columbia University, working with CPC, with the Climate Prediction Center again, is probably fairly good chances of La Nina conditions continuing on through the early part of winter and then decreasing quite rapidly as we get into the later parts of the winter of 23. So that's what we're showing here. And what does that mean? A typical wintertime La Nina pattern. Again, I talked about the drier and warmer conditions across the southern tier of the United States, as well as that wet pocket in the Pacific Northwest and the Ohio River Valley. And if I go back a couple slides, the winter outlook is really reflecting that. A little bit more warmth on the East Coast than what is in a typical La Nina pattern. But again, the key with La Nina is it has to behave this way. Not all La Ninas or El Ninas, for that matter, will always behave in this manner. The key to this is where those jet streams, the Pacific jet and the polar jet, where they set up through the winter months will be very much a determining factor on what kind of weather and conditions we see during that time. The seasonal drought outlook, very bullish and reflective of that 7-day precipitation forecast that I showed. You're seeing those improvements again from the Four Corners regions in the southwest through the southern plains, catching portions of southern Kansas and southern Missouri, where we're showing drought removal in green or improvement in that gray. The areas in brown are where drought is going to continue to persist. Again, this has taken us all the way through the end of November now, and possibly some development up in Montana and North Dakota with some of these areas that we are already identifying as being dry.
And Brian, that may seem a little inconsistent with the forecast. So I want to. You're right that they're keying on this 5 to 10 inches over a couple states or whatever it is, a lot of rain. And let's also remember that when you average those months out, August through November, with all the precipitation that's going to fall, is that November is a pretty darn dry month overall, generally. And actually, as you get closer and closer to August, it gets wetter and wetter. So we're going to get, if you get the lion's share of that period of precipitation in August, you may be covered in terms of improving drought over that period, because you'll always be showing an above average precipitation for that entire period. So I think that's part of it, plus part that the monsoon is going to, they don't see an end in sight, I guess, for the monsoon. So. Just some.
Those are great points to make, Doug. I don't have anything to add on that, but those are great additions to what I said, and pretty much make note of that. Because we are approaching fall, the first freeze comes to people's minds, and this is coming from the Midwest Regional Climate Center over at Purdue. And you can see some of these dates. This is, again, the median or the 50th percentile of when they typically happen. And so it's not out of the realm that in some of those darker blues in Wyoming and Montana and even into Colorado and the Dakotas, that September 1st to September 10th with that navy blue, those are the 50th percentile of the first 32-degree freeze. So again, not too far off the horizon and things to be thinking about, especially in some of those wetter areas of the region that had some later planted crops and a cooler spring to begin with. Some of those production windows may end up coming into play, but we'll worry about that for next month's call. Just the last thing to talk about here is some of the wildland fire potential that's coming out. So we have September on the left and October on the right. And again, we've already seen some of the same areas of eastern Wyoming, western Nebraska, northeast Colorado, and into the Black Hills and southern Missouri too, where it's been extremely dry. And Chip Redmond from Kansas made a great point on our check-in call yesterday. And fire is Chip's thing to begin with, but he said some of these rains have been really great for weed growth, that they're going to end up increasing that fuel load on some of these areas that have been fairly dry. And so we may see some other areas pop up here. And of course, during harvest season, it's always a danger, especially on a dry year, with equipment going in and out of fields and whatnot. And then again, October, we see this increase from southern or in Minnesota and Iowa and Missouri that stands out for our region. So just quick summary bullets. nothing new here. Historical flooding in Kentucky as well as the St. Louis metro since the last call. Cooler temperatures have been mixed in throughout the summer and especially the last couple weeks. Warmer than normal pattern for much of the region overall. We had flash drought develop in a couple different regions, southern Missouri first and then southern Iowa and portions of Nebraska in the last month. Warm and dry autumn is expected over much of the region, and La Nina will impact the U.S. early this winter before weakening and subsiding. So, again, we got different links for folks if you go to the recording or the shared PDF of this talk. And a lot of people came together, myself and Dennis and Doug and Melissa and Gannon and Molly and Britt and others, the state climate offices especially, have all chimed in here to help me get organized for today. And with that, I will start with questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Brian. If it wasn't clear, I think it was, but if you had some questions about La Nina occurring for the third time in 3 years, I don't want to overblow this in any way, shape, or form, and it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have exactly the same climate this fall as we did last fall and the fall before that. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean it does tip our forecasts in a particular manner. Brian showed that image of the general pattern of a stereotypical La Nina. Unfortunately, not one La Nina is stereotypical, so they're all going to be a little bit different. But that dry and warm in places that are already in severe drought and such, like Texas and such, they probably won't get saved by these 5 inches of rain if La Nina materializes the same way this fall. Generally, for our part of the world, we're dry and warm often in the fall. Very rule of thumb as opposed to absolute. Dennis, do you want to say anything more about the third La Nina and what that portends?
Really, no. The Climate Prediction Center has indicated they're playing it like a regular La Nina.
Yeah.
And
back one more.
Yeah, we've only had twice we've had 3-year back-to-back La Ninas, so it's really hard to develop much of a composite or much of an average from those two.
Yeah, the one thing about La Ninas, and we've said this before, is that variation is what is common often. They're highly variable, as opposed to El Ninos, to be honest. They're a little more better behaving, but none of them are perfect. Okay, let's go to the questions real quick. Okay, the first question was historic rainfalls in St. Louis and Eastern Kentucky. There was some question of whether what this guy said, the QPF, which is the quantitative precipitation forecast, didn't nail it very well. And one of the replies to that is, in terms of forecasting, first of all, extreme events are very difficult to forecast, except you could argue that when hurricanes are coming or tropical systems, we do a pretty good job of saying you're really going to get wet and it's going to rain a lot, right? But when it comes to what we call convective systems that sometimes afternoon thunderstorms and such, our models have a more difficult time doing those types of precipitation events, especially when they're on the extreme side, than we do certainly with temperature, and certainly in the warm season, the summer, it's harder than it is in the winter in terms of our precipitation forecast. So I do think both those were pretty good when it came down to the last 24 hours. If you look 7 days out and you didn't see the big rain, that's one thing. If you look, within 24 to 48 hours, usually our models have a pretty good handle on it's going to rain a lot. Now, it may not hit the peak of what actually happens, but it's a pretty good indicator of very heavy precipitation.
One thing I'll add to that, Doug, is I shared the link to the Weather Service St. Louis Weather Service page on the St. Louis event, and they had a great point there that the thunderstorms just continued to go over the same area, what we call training, and that you can't forecast that. Really, that's a lot of different meteorological things coming together in the perfect setting to have that happen. But wherever it happens, if you have rain events that behave that way, you typically see very heavy rains on a very short period of time over the same area. And St. Louis was an example of that. Kentucky was a little bit different from that, but still some of that same cell after cell after cell going over the same region.
That's right. That's right. That's what usually it takes, is lots of thunderstorms over the same piece of land, if you will. Okay, and there was a question about sorghum and sorghum problems that we're going to have this year and how bad the forecast is for the harvest. And it was a question about did the fires have anything to do with that, or was it really drought? And the answer is very simple. It's dryness and hot. Usually the two almost always go together, but not always. But in this case, it was just incredible heat day after day after day and no rain. And sorghum is actually, and as Dennis will say, is a fairly drought resistant crop. Dennis, do you want to say any more?
We can't say that there weren't a few fields that were affected by fires early, because I did see some pictures that from the Kansas folks that were shared early on. But by and large, Doug's right. It's heat and drought. We don't want to belabor this, but there, when Brian had the graphic up, there seems to be a dichotomy or two different regimes we have with sorghum. Either things are fairly good because the graphic had a bunch of lines across the top, or you have really bad drought years. And we're in one of those really bad drought years where sorghum was not doing very well.
This one is for you, Brian. The Lincoln, Nebraska area seems much drier than what the drought monitor is showing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there has been a lot of what I call hit and miss or localized precipitation events, and to look at one area compared to the surrounding areas. I pulled up the numbers for Nebraska here for the calendar year. We're at 70 to 80% of normal, which isn't in Lancaster County, which is where Lincoln is. That's not too far out of the realm. So our clay soils around here probably visually I know I have big cracks in my yard and I water my yard. So and we had some very wet periods in this region too. So we've kind of went dry, wet, dry, and probably see some changes on the drought monitor going forward if things don't, if the pattern doesn't change.
All right, so here's one that a broader kind of question. There seems to be a pattern of dry conditions in the western region and wetter conditions in the eastern region over the past several years. Is this a recent trend, and will it be a precursor for future climate in the north central region? That's that is a $1 trillion question, as you know, Benjamin. So what I'll say about this particular year is often when we see strong monsoons, there is a deficit of precipitation in the southern plains, sometimes stretching as in this year up into Nebraska and even southern South Dakota. So there tends to be a relationship between a really good monsoon, and this year is an incredible monsoon, and that's really rain in the southwestern part of the U.S. and dryness just to the east in the plains. In terms of patterns, we have seen the Midwest become wetter more. You're right. Yeah, that is something that you're correct in noticing. And dryness in the south and the west, southwest really pattern with Colorado River, et cetera, being in a long-term drought. Some people actually wonder if that is a drought or if that's normal. If that's normal, and really we don't know the answer completely to that, but it is obviously we're all hoping for 200% of normal snowpack in the Southwest for the next 5 years. That would help a lot. But no one's predicting that. And with La Nina this year, I can talk more about that. I can definitely say if another dry year, it's going to continue to complicate matters in the Southwest in terms of dryness. The monsoon helped, but the monsoon is more spotty and it doesn't contribute incredibly. There'll be some flash floods and such, but it doesn't contribute incredibly to the major reservoirs out there, which is interesting in and of itself. It's just a hot time of year, a lot of evaporation, all that stuff. Wintertime's different.
I'll throw in a counter argument to the plains too. We talked about La Nina being with us for the last 3 years. If you look at summer composites or summer averages during La Ninas, there is an increased risk of heat and dry during summer for La Nina years.
Yep.
So that it's not a guarantee it's going to happen every year, but that could have also had some influence.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. And anyway, so have we reached the point of no return, Dennis? Have we reached the point of no return for rainfall to benefit corn yield?
Not absolute. I mean, there are places where corn still could use a little bit of moisture. I sat in on a Minnesota extension meeting, and they talked about we're in the grain filling, the end of the grain filling period of corn. So there is a chance you could get a little bit more yield by getting more starch into the grain, the kernels, and making bigger kernels. We are late in the game to be able to have a big shift at this point. We could still help soybeans. It's getting late for soybeans. We could still help them. But as Brian mentioned, out in the plains, we're starting to look towards, well, for every place now, we're looking towards, can we get water back in the soil to start the recharge for next year? And in places that do winter grains or do cover crops, can we get some more water back in the soil so we can get those established later in the fall?
Yep. And even if we have below normal precipitation from here through the end of the year, if it's timely, it can still be beneficial. And
it can still be beneficial. We need precip. That's flat out. We need precip in a lot of places right now.
Right. And then thank you, Mary. She's mentioning the Bomb Cyclone, which was a hard forecast in March of 2019, which caused incredible flooding and such across Nebraska, and lots of things contributed to that. I think she's making that point because of what we talked about precip and how hard that is to very heavy precipitation in the summer and how hard that is to forecast, especially over a large area. So, well, actually, especially over local areas, I should say. And that is the end of the questions of the day. Do we have any comments? We have the Drought Mitigation Center, Brian Fuchs on, and Brian, anything you want to say about this year's drought, or this year's conditions? How weird is it, or how normal is it when it comes to flash droughts in July and the heat that we saw in July? In some respects, if we're going to get it, that's when it happens, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That we keep talking about, well, what climate change is going to do in the region, right? But if you go back and look at things, we're already seeing some of that. We're seeing these rapidly developing extreme events on both the wet and dry spectrum, leading to flash floods, to flash droughts, and everything in between. And the summer is the most vulnerable time for that because of if you get the absence of the moisture with the addition of the heat, as we saw in places in Missouri and Iowa and Kansas, conditions, and even here in Nebraska, conditions went from being fairly good to really, really bad in just 4 or 5 weeks.
Yep.
And that is going to become more of the norm than what we're probably used to. And for the region as a whole, we haven't seen this kind of widespread drought through this region since 2012, 2013. So it's been a while. It's been a decade since we've really went through something of this spatial characteristics as far as drought goes. And looking at some of the flash drought numbers, we ran them here at the NDMC National Drought Mitigation Center, and we only found in 23 years of the Drought Monitor 1 or 2 instances where flash drought on such a large scale happened the way it did this year in the Missouri, Arkansas, Ozark Plateau area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you're taking an extreme event and you're seeing the extreme end of an extreme event.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. And thanks everybody for sticking on. We're going to have Darren Clabo up next month. He is a fire expert, but also a meteorologist, climatologist out of South Dakota. He's going to give us the talk. So that should be interesting. And especially if you're interested in fire, I think he'll probably have more to say on that. So thank you all. Everybody have a good day, and we will see you next month. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
And thank you, Brian and Dennis.
No, I appreciate the help. Like I said, I was on a short window this week with so many other things going on, and a lot of help from the region to put it all together pretty much since yesterday afternoon. So I definitely can shout out to the folks in our region because they are participating, and I think those are relationships that you two have built, and people want to help. So that's awesome. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, Brian. It takes a big village in this case.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, safe travels back to